Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 7247 in the name of Tom Arthur on asset transfers and community empowerment. 5 years on, I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible, and I call on the Minister to speak and move the motion around 10 minutes. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to bring this debate to Parliament, providing us with an opportunity to reflect on the progress we have made in 5 years since introducing landmark asset transfer legislation that has empowered our communities to take on many of our public places and spaces. Today's debate provides us with a chance to hear about the difference asset transfers have made locally in Scotland, enabling community organisations to take over management and ownership of many public spaces. It also allows us an opportunity to consider some of the challenges we face, such as supporting our most vulnerable communities to engage with asset transfers. Community asset transfer isn't something new. Our communities have a long history of owning and managing land and buildings. Local authorities have worked with community organisations for many years, agreeing transfer of assets that have often been surplus and where the benefits of community management have been recognised. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the hard work carried out across the country by local authorities and other public service partners to develop community asset management and ownership strategies. Since the introduction of the Community Empowerment Act 2015, this initial good work has been strengthened by introducing new rights for community organisations submitting asset transfers, including a right of appeal, and by placing new responsibilities on public authorities to decide on applications and set timescales, transparently, and publish details of their assets and asset transfer activity annually. Since asset transfer legislation was introduced in January 2017, much has happened. The Scottish Government has worked directly with the 95 public authorities, known as relevant authorities, to establish and support annual reporting processes, including developing an annual reporting template to capture the necessary data. We commissioned researchers at Glasgow Caledonian University to carry out an evaluation on the first 3 years of asset transfer activity, which reported in July 2020. We set up the National Asset Transfer Action Group of partners and community representatives to consider the Glasgow evaluation and challenges to embed asset transfer. And we hosted 2 national events for asset transfer in 2021, one for the relevant authorities and another for community organisations. Through these actions, we have learned a lot about how the legislation is working on the ground. For example, we know that local authorities currently receive most requests, but there are signs this is changing as other relevant authorities come on board and help community groups take on their assets. Back in 2017-18, 85% of the total number of asset transfer requests were made to local authorities, with only 15% made to other public bodies. By 2021-22, 46% of the total amount of requests made were to other public authorities, including health boards from Lanarkshire, Dumfries and Galloway, Fife, Grampian, Highland and Western Isles, with Scottish Government agencies, including Scottish Water and Forestry and Land Scotland, also receiving requests. And it's more than just numbers and data. These figures represent a tangible change to the way communities are now controlling their own place. For example, Forestry and Land Scotland transferred the Ferrypools car park in Skye to Minginish Community Hall Association, who went on to provide better facilities at the site. And NHS Lanarkshire transferred Croy Clinic to Croy Community Hub Limited on an initial lease with the view of transferring full ownership, creating local jobs and enabling a local community space for the development of community groups. More than 350 asset transfers have been made using asset transfer legislation since 2017, with over 200 granted and many more in progress. This has played a significant role in maintaining the upward trajectory of overall community land use in Scotland. Of course, asset transfer sits within a wider community land use setting, with other mechanisms available for communities to take on land or buildings. We know from the latest Community Ownership in Scotland Report 2021, published by the Scottish Government in September of this year, that there has been a steady upward trend in community ownership from a known 84 community-owned assets in the year 2000 to 711 in 2021. There has been more than a six-fold jump in community groups owning assets in the same period, from 74 groups owning assets in 2000 to 484 community groups owning assets in 2021. Presiding Officer, our work with partners plays a vital role in embedding asset transfer policy. We fund the Community Ownership Support Service, COSS, who provide expert support and advice on the asset transfer process to community groups and also to the relevant authorities. We established the aforementioned National Asset Transfer Action Group in October 2020 to help us respond to the recommendations of the Glasgow Caledonian Report. And they also helped inform the annual reporting template we developed to support relevant authorities meet their statutory duty to publish asset transfer data annually. The group also supported our work responding to the findings of the Local Government and Communities Committee from the last parliamentary session, who made recommendations relating to asset transfer. And we have listened to advice and, working with the National Group and our partners, have acted on recommendations, including our launch of the Asset Transfer Guidance for Considering Social Value in September of this year. Although we rightly celebrate the success of asset transfer, we are now working to better understand the detail of the data and learning gathered over the last 5 years. There is work underway to learn from those authorities promoting and embracing asset transfer and work to understand the cold spots of little or no activity and why this should be. And we are listening to our community organisations and acting on their feedback and experiences. This work will form part of the wider review of the Community Empowerment Act, which I launched in the summer of this year at the Loch Ness Community Hub in Glenurquhart. Here I saw first-hand the achievements of a local community organisation, Glenurquhart Rural Community Association, who took on a former tourist information centre using an asset transfer in 2018, and working with partners has turned it into a vibrant community hub, employing local people and operating a green transport business. As we progress the review, learning such as this will be explored with our partners and communities who have been asked their views on what's working and what needs to change. Presiding Officer, I want to now take a few moments to speak about some of the other key developments backed by the Scottish Government that will support communities to take on the running and ownership of more landing assets, as well as supporting wider community empowerment objectives. Community wealth building provides national and local government, the first sector, private sector and communities with an opportunity to approach economic development in a new way, creating conditions for the people of Scotland to own a greater stake in local economies and shared wealth. We have seen significant progress made in the pilot areas of Clackmannanshire, south of Scotland, Western Isles, Tay Cities Fife and Glasgow City region, with all developing and embedding bespoke community wealth building action plans supported by the Scottish Government. In addition, the £3 million Ayrshire Growth Deal Community Wealth Building Fund commenced delivery in April of last year and is supporting local businesses and community organisations to grow local wealth. Through partnerships with local communities, businesses and anchor organisations, local authorities are taking collective action to implement community wealth building, helping create fairer local economies that tackle poverty and inequality, focus on well-being and inclusion and maximise the benefits of public spend and strategic decision-making. Locally, that could be small businesses or social enterprises winning procurement contracts for the first time, the creation of new local jobs or the protection of existing jobs, as well as communities owning and managing more local assets. The Community Empowerment Act review provides an additional opportunity to build on these successes, and there is an opportunity to progress this further through a more comprehensive place-focused model of economic development, both at the local and regional levels. To further support the implementation of community wealth building, we have committed to develop legislation and to hold a consultation to help us gather a wide range of views on the changes required to grow local wealth and give communities a greater stake in the economy. Whilst asset transfer is an important tool in providing opportunities to communities throughout Scotland to acquire assets and take over services, there are other options for acquisition, for example through the various right-to-buy requests as contained in the Land Reform Act Scotland 2003 and 2016. The Scottish Government also provides £10 million per year to support communities to acquire assets through the Scottish Land Fund. Over the last 5 years, the fund has given grants of over £39 million to more than 230 projects across Scotland. In 2020-21, our programme for government committed to a new 5-year SLF that commenced in April 2021, which will seek to double the SLF to £20 million by the end of this Parliament, enabling many more community groups to engage with public land ownership. As well as our support for the Scottish Land Fund, our place-based investment programme embeds at its core community empowerment and equality, backed with an initial £325 million capital investment over the next 5 years to support community-led regeneration and accelerate our ambitions for place, 20-minute neighbourhoods and town centres, helping create conditions that support community wealth building. The place-based investment programme builds on the successful impact of the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund and Town Centre Action Plans and the partnerships and networks that have been built over a number of of years. It aims to link and align all place-based funding initiatives to ensure that we have a coherent approach to build resilient communities and promote inclusive well-being and growth. It is complemented by our Empowering Communities programme, which provides support to develop and build the capacity, resilience and sustainability of our communities, for which community ownership is a key part in helping to create more resilient and sustainable communities. And local government is a key partner in delivering the place-based investment programme and will receive an allocation of £140 million capital funding over the course of this Parliament. In addition to accelerating our shared ambitions for place, this funding will also contribute to net zero, well-being, inclusive economic development, tackling inequality and disadvantage and community involvement and ownership. To complement this work, we've also been supporting participatory budgeting and, of course, participation requests as contained within the Act. I very much look forward to the contributions this afternoon, Presiding Officer, as we recognise the tremendous impact that asset transfer is happening, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. I now call on Douglas Lumsden to speak to and move Amendment 7247.1 around 7 minutes. Mr.
Thank you, President Officer. I'll try not to go as quick as the Minister there. And also thank you to the Government for bringing this debate to Parliament, which highlights the fantastic organisations that we have across Scotland that are doing so much to improve our communities, bringing buildings and spaces back into public use. Presiding Officer, as a former councillor, I've seen first-hand the importance of empowering our communities. Whilst this SNP government has stepped back, our communities have stepped up. With continued cuts to local authority funding, more responsibility has been passed on to local community groups. From planting flower beds to our Christmas lights displays, communities and up and down this country have stepped up while this government have failed. Buildings that once stood proudly in our town and village centres have fallen into disrepair due to shrinking council budgets. However, Presiding Officer, thanks to the UK Government's Community Ownership Fund, some of these buildings are now being brought back into community use. We Conservatives believe that we must put communities first. Empowering communities is absolutely critical in ensuring that our towns and villages can be the vibrant and thriving places they ought to be. The reality is that no one knows better at how to achieve this than the individuals and families that live in those communities. Centralisation simply doesn't work. We need to see power move down to local communities, not the other way. Presiding Officer, from 2017 to 2021, I was the convener of Aberdeen City Council's Finance Committee, the committee that dealt with the local authorities' community transfer requests, with varying degrees of success depending on the asset and the group looking to acquire it. Presiding Officer, I will, however, start with some successes. The Seaton Hubs and Depot was an old, disused council property. In 2018, it was agreed that the depot would be sold to the Seaton Community Church for just £1. They subsequently spent over £500,000 demolishing the old building and constructed not just a church, but a brand new community facility. And whilst doing my research for this debate today, I even found an old press clipping from 2018 that I had myself quoted as saying that their work will make a real and lasting difference to the residents who live in the area, and that by using surplus council assets in new ways and supporting the goals of partners like the Seaton Community Church, we can make a real difference to people across the city. So it just shows, Presiding Officer, I sometimes get things right after all, because today the church has a full calendar of events, from cage football to baby and toddler groups, proving a real asset for the community. And I would like to thank and commend Barry Douglas, who had the vision and determination to see the project through. Another success story can be found in Fitty. Established in 2015, the Fitty Community Development Trust sought to secure the Gospel Hall with the aim to renovate it for the community through fundraising. They were successful in securing the hall back in 2018 and are now well on their way to achieving their goals. Despite these positive stories, there was also some challenging asset transfers that have not yet been completed. One of these is Westburn House. Found in Aberdeen's Westburn Park, the house is a much-loved part of the city's heritage. Sadly, Westburn House is rapidly falling into disrepair, with the roof now having collapsed, and the huge cost to make the building wind and watertight appears to be the biggest hurdle for any revival. There is a will from the local authority to transfer the asset. The community support the transfer, and they have a plan for the building use, but the sources of funding are limited. They have raised about £7,000, but this would be a drop in the ocean compared to the sums that are required. These are only a few rare urban examples rural areas have been much more successful in implementing asset transfers. According to the Scottish Government's figures, only 5% of community buyouts have been in urban areas. The Urban Hub Manager for Community Land Scotland has criticised the lack of progress for urban areas, saying community land ownership has been transformative in hundreds of communities across Scotland, but the potential in urban areas hasn't been delivered yet. It should be a normal option in cities like it is in the Highlands and Islands. Perhaps the Minister would like to give an indication of how this is to be addressed in the summing up remarks. The UK Government's Community Ownership Fund has significant financial benefits for Scotland. Already, venues serving communities across Scotland are currently being supported by £2 million of investment from the fund. In addition to this, the Levelling Up initiative sees Scotland benefiting from £2 billion of direct investment from the UK Government. In addition to this, the UK Government Renewals Fund also provides additional financial support of £220 million to prepare the way for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. But more still needs to be done. The process of community asset transfer is hugely complicated, with unnecessary red tape before an asset transfer can be agreed. It requires a huge amount of legal knowledge and planning by community groups prior to any transfer, which is often beyond the scope of the smaller groups. Much more support is needed for groups to enable them to find their way through the process and see more of the buildings and assets that have fallen into disrepair being brought back into life in our communities. The SNP say they want to empower local communities, but at the same time are centralising services. They seem to be giving on one hand and taking away the other. Much more clarity is required from this government. Do you want local communities and local councils to have more say in their own destinies, or do you want to centralise services such as adult and children's social care? So while I welcome this motion, Presiding Officer, I would urge the Scottish Government not to rest on their laurels. Work still needs to be done. We need more community empowerment, not less. We need to cut the red tape for community groups and help them make applications for asset transfers. We need to work with the UK Government to fund projects, and we need to stop the centralisation of services away from our local communities. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Lumsden. I now call on Paul Sweeney to speak to and move Amendment 7247.2 for around 5 minutes. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I rise to move the amendment in my name. And I certainly commend the spirit, and Labour does commend the spirit of the community ownership endeavours in Scotland, the community empowerment efforts in Scotland, because of course it was Labour who originally established community land ownership in Scotland. And we welcome all steps to, in principle, empower communities to take greater control over their destinies under the principle of subsidiarity, of course. But we have to look at the context in which this Act has been undertaken, where we've seen increasing retrenchment of local government. We've seen in Glasgow's case £1 in every £10 available to the city removed, cut in the last decade, which has placed significant distress on the delivery of local services. So what we're increasingly seeing is assets being transferred in a manner in which they are being distressed. They're not actually being done in a way in which is productive or constructive. It's almost akin to a fire sale. And that has been a major issue that's characterised the disposal of assets in urban areas. Of course, the Conservative spokesperson had highlighted this issue, that only 5% of community asset transfers are taking place in urban areas, but increasingly those that do are taking place in the context of distress situations. An example in Glasgow, which has been going on for many years, of course, is the Govan Baths, which was closed by Glasgow City Council over 20 years ago and was occupied by the community in a protest. And it was many years later that they were actually able to successfully win funding through the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund and the Heritage Lottery Fund to begin the process of restoring that particular community asset after a long-running battle with the council. But even now, as they ostensibly are succeeding in delivering the regeneration programme, indeed I actually bought a tile, engraved tile, to help fundraise towards it. The community could buy little engraved tiles for the swimming pool. The construction inflation has ran away from the project to such an extent that it's now going to be difficult to deliver the regeneration outcomes that were originally envisaged, and thus puts in jeopardy the grant funding that supported the community asset transfer in the first place. So we're in a bit of a vicious cycle at the moment, Minister, in this situation where we're transferring assets and actually delivering the intended outcomes are being really difficult. Not only are councils seeing retrenchment of services, we're seeing the capacity of communities to rise to the challenge to take on these assets frustrated as well, not just by the paucity of the grant funding available, but also the inflationary pressures being faced too. So these are difficulties. I mean, actually, one of the first things that motivated me to get involved with politics was watching the ongoing destruction and dilapidation of the historic properties in Springburn, where I grew up. I used to see every day the Springburn public halls, the once proud centre of Springburn, lying boarded up, falling apart, and then hoping that one day someone would come along and fix it, realising increasingly that the council were never going to do this. In fact, the council wanted to knock it down. In fact, it's 10 years almost to the day that overnight, the 27th of December 2012, the council came in and demolished that building overnight with no discussion with the community, no constructive attempts to try and find a solution that would save it. Happy to give way on that point.
Bob Doris.
And thank the member for giving way. And on that point, I'm not a part of political point, but as a MSP for the city, I made many representations to the local authority at that time. They seem to fall on deaf ears, and sometimes local authorities need to take more responsibility for the pastoral care they have of traditional buildings in their communities. And right across Scotland, they just have to do better. I know there's financial constraints, but they have to be more imaginative and more innovative also.
Paul Sweeney, I can give you the time back.
I thank the member for his point, and he makes a very assertive, astute point, should I say, in this regard. There's so much risk aversion in local government when it comes to community asset transfers, but they're not realising this full potential. And I think that is reflected in the Caledonian University report. In the case of Springburn Public Halls, the intended disposal was to a private property developer, which due to the 2008 credit crunch fell through. And then the next step was to clear the site, to dispose of a clean site to a housing association. And this was a listed property, B-listed, a source of great pride and esteem in this community that was destroyed. And it was only out of the wake of that trauma, the real disgust that was felt in Springburn, palpable actually, we saw the rise. It was a stimulus actually for people to get involved. There was that realisation that the council's not going to be a white knight here. They're not going to ride to our rescue. We need to start forming our own organisations that gave birth to the Springburn Winter Gardens Trust, as Mr Doris will be aware of, but also the Spirit of Springburn and other organisations. And now we see actually a quite rich tapestry of organisations in Springburn, but increasingly we're still frustrated by a lack of financial capacity. Only just recently, Springburn Winter Gardens Trust has been frustrated in its attempts to get UK Government levelling up funding. It was passed over by Glasgow City Council without any real explanation, and also was rejected from the Scottish Government's Regeneration Capital Grant Fund. And I can't see how demoralising it is for communities that are already at a low ebb, have lack of capacity, and are getting constantly hit in the face when they do try and be constructive and proactive. And I think the Minister has to reflect that there's only so much people can take in terms of frustration before they just give up. And I think there needs to be more pastoral support, more functional support in terms of administration, helping to write bids and so on, to try and support communities in this regard. And I think that's where the Act is deficient, and that's where our amendment tries to address these issues, that there's needing to be further resourcing to look at things like conservation deficits, the availability of grant funding, not just to create a kind of ferrets in a sack type approach where people are scrabbling for finite funding, where there's always going to be the most people losing out. There's going to be a minority of people actually winning these funds at any given year, and that increasing situation of vulnerability. So in that regard, I think there are a number of deficiencies in the Act as it's currently being managed. We need to go further to resource this, and particularly in urban areas where the greatest issue and need is in terms of deprivation. So on that, I hope the Minister will address those points as the debate progresses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Sweeney. We now move to the open debate. I call first Paul McLennan, to be followed by Alexander Stewart for around 4 minutes. Mr McLennan.
Officer. Can I thank the Scottish Government for bringing forward the debate today? In researching for the debate, I looked at the Accounts Commission, who looked at the principles of community empowerment in 2019, and I think it's important that we remember what these are. The first one is community control, and it's supporting communities, and Paul Sweeney just touched on that, as did the Minister, on supporting communities to successfully take more control over decisions and assets. I've seen a couple of examples in my own hometown. A bakery was taken over, Dunbar Community Bakery, and a Crunchy Carrot, both successful businesses in their own right just now. The other thing, obviously, is clear public leadership, and again, we've heard that. I think it's really important, and the Minister touched upon that it's different in different parts of the country. So I think we need strong, clear leadership and community empowerment. That sets a tone, I think, for organisation. I think that sets a tone for the communities themselves. We need to send out a clear and consistent message from local authorities in that regard. And effective relationships, that's incredibly important. We need to build effective working relationships between public bodies, local communities and local partners. And I know in the Local Government Committee we've been talking about the governance review and how all that works and how all that flows in as well. I think another key body to play in part of that that's not been mentioned so far is the TSIs, and what role they can play in supporting local groups build up capacity so they can take on these challenges. And of course, improving outcomes. We need to evaluate whether outcomes for local communities are improving and inequalities are being reduced. evaluation is a key measure going forward, especially in the roundabout social impact. So I maybe ask the Minister to pick on that when he winds up. And his speech, and of course accountability. We need to be accountable and transparent. Public bodies are clear and open about their approach to community empowerment and provide regular information to communities that themselves. That is obviously understandable, jargon-free and accessible. So all these are key as we look at the community ownership and asset transfer. I think, as the Minister mentioned, community ownership in Scotland in 2021 found that there were 711 assets in community ownership this time last year. That's more than a six-fold increase since 2000. Just over half, 395, were acquired after 2010, with the 2015 Community Empowerment Act and 2016 Land Reform Act being key drivers. Promoting the Community Empowerment Programme will be vital to sustain and accelerate the steady upward trend. The great thing about asset transfer is benefiting both rural and urban communities. A recent report published by Community Land Scotland has revealed that 20% of all community-owned assets are now urban and not just rural. The change came about following the Community Right to Buy extended to cover urban areas in 2016, and as has been mentioned before, almost £7 million of funding was provided by the Scottish Land Fund to enable the buyouts. Ailsa Rayburn, Chair of Community Land Scotland, said, in the last 5 years since the introduction of the game-changing Community Empowerment Act and the extension of the Scottish Land Fund to all of Scotland's communities, the energy, ambition and achievement of Scotland's urban communities has been inspiring. And that's a trick. We need to make sure we're inspiring our communities to take these projects on. All over Scotland, people have been using the new powers and funding made available to them by the Scottish Government since 2016 to buy and run shops, redundant churches, we heard from Douglas Lumsden, community centres, high street buildings, woodland parks, pubs and bowling greens. Community Land Scotland said the struggles many of them had to go through to save their local facility or bring back a derelict building or site back into use or campaign for local generation has given them the strength and skills to respond to these new challenges. Local communities know best in this regard. Ailsa Rayburn then went on to say there are so many successes from the first 5 years of urban land reform in Scotland, and this highlights the vision and tenacity of urban community owners and establishes transformational impact of community ownership and community-led development in urban areas. So what can we do in the next 5 years? The Planning Minister launched a review of the Community Empowerment Act in July, providing a chance to further benefit communities. Local communities know their localities better than local councils or national government. We need to ensure that we keep all power local and continue shifting the balance of power to our communities. We need to ensure local people can have even more of a say in the things that matter to them. The Minister talked about the National Asset Transfer Group, which I think was set up in 2020, which I think will be incredibly important. And of course, the National Planning Framework has ensured that local councils and communities retain a key role in planning and infrastructure. The place principle lies at the heart of NPF4, building communities throughout Scotland. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the Community Empowerment Act, in particular asset transfer, has proved a success in the past 5 years. Our challenge in the next 5 is to ensure our communities have the capacity, funding and support from local and national government. Our rural and urban communities, as well as our town centres, will benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McLennan. I now call Alexander Stewart to be followed by Colette Stevenson for around 4 minutes. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate, and I will be supporting the amendment in the name of Douglas Lumsden. A common feature across all communities in Scotland is the desire to be involved in decision-making at all possible levels. Community empowerment is the responsibility of both local and central government, and I therefore welcome the opportunity to debate this today. The Community Empowerment Act of 2015 was an attempt to promote local government by enshrining into law several different contexts. As part of the Local Government and Communities Committee in the previous Parliament, I contributed to the report which assessed how effective the Act had been in the 4 years since it became law. Looking at Part 5 of the Act, it was clear there was still more to be done to unlock the potential benefits of asset transfer requests. While awareness of asset transfer is now high among community groups, in practice there are still too much variation on how smoothly the process is running. For example, some groups are finding themselves being offered leases instead of ownership of an asset, with public authorities sometimes reluctant to recognise the effective transfer can be about more than just a monetary value, but the potential benefits to the community, Presiding Officer. Our committee was told that it had, by all means...
Paul Sweeney.
I thank the member for giving way. He makes a very astute point about the issue of having these clawback clauses and these kind of lease arrangements, because actually they can militate against qualifying for grants that then frustrate the very delivery of the project that is trying to be achieved. So it can actually have a vicious effect.
Alexander Stewart, and I can give you that time back.
Thank you. I thank the member for that intervention. And yes, he makes a very valid point. You know, if there is not that cooperation or that understanding or that knowledge and base taking place, then it's not going to progress, and it frustrates the whole process within the community. So the public, as I say, are well aware of the difficulties, and our committee was told that as a result, in some communities, they were being put through the ringer during this whole process. Now, that was never the intention, presiding officer, of the Act, putting individuals in communities through a process that was becoming problematic. The cultural shift required was no doubt that this should take place, and the evidence in the reports have shown that there are yet to be much more achieved. Further clarification is needed on how Part 5 should work when it comes to arm's-length organisations. Given the significant number of potential community assets that organisations own or operate in or on behalf of councils, public authorities or community groups, there must be clearer understanding of how Community Empowerment Act applies to these areas. True empowerment of our communities will depend not just on unlocking the potential, but ensuring that there will be the opportunity to support. While the Act aims to empower communities in certain issues, we know that communities are being diminished in many other ways. Since 2017, nearly half of all planning decisions that have been appealed by ministers have been overturned, presiding officer. This translates to hundreds of decisions being overturned against the wishes of the community and community-elected representatives. In the face of decreasing local government budgets, there has been and there will continue to be funding issues set out. So throughout the whole time in local government, I have learned that community empowerment is something that requires improvements in several areas. Whilst I hope the benefits of asset transfer can be realised over time, this must take place and will take some time to ensure that it's possible. So in conclusion, no, I'll happily take another.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Member. He's been very generous indeed. It makes a really important point about planning appeals, and particularly these can be used to ride roughshod over local opinion. Would he think that perhaps a measure that could be looked at is making final right of appeal to this Parliament, as a committee of this Parliament, rather than it being in a bureaucracy in St Andrews House?
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the member for the intervention, and I think Paul Sweeney makes once again a very valid point that there should be more involvement with us here, rather than just ministers through a pen or through an action indicating what they require. So in conclusion, presiding officer, the government motion is right to talk about improvements and ensuring that assets and community-led regeneration are part of the wealth that we see within these communities. The Parliament, along with COSLA and local authorities across Scotland, are united in wishing to see communities empowered across the country. All communities are all willing to report, yet there seems to be some goals that we're not quite achieving. The journey is still in its early stages in going forward, and the onus must be on all of us to keep pushing to ensure that people are truly able to have a greater say in how their communities are empowered. Thank you, presiding officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Stewart. I now call Colette Stevenson to be followed by Paul O'Kane. Around 4 minutes, Ms Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate allows us to celebrate and reflect upon the first 5 years of the asset transfer legislation, which is an important tool for building a Scotland where everyone can play their full part in society. As a successful part of Scotland's community empowerment agenda, this scheme allows communities to take control of local assets and use them to develop their own economies, enhance their well-being and nurture the environment. I want to mention an excellent story from East Kilbride. Back in 2019, East Kilbride United took over the Kirkton Home playing fields and pavilion through an asset transfer. Since then, the area has been transformed, with two of the best grass football pitches in the west of Scotland, 4 state-of-the-art changing rooms, as well as a fully licensed club room and cafe. It has been really great to see the input from the local community and local businesses, with time and materials donated to help the redevelopment. Kirkton Home is home to several teams now, from the AG4s right through to the Jerry Hattricks, a walking football group. And the positive contribution of this redevelopment goes beyond football. When local council halls closed during COVID, many community groups were left with nowhere to go. Thankfully, EK United stepped in and allowed the Special Needs Adventure Playground, or SNAP as it's better known, to use their renovated facilities. SNAP was recognised by the Care Inspectorate as an essential service, and it was heartening to see the community-run facility at Kirkton Home being offered to this vital group. The development continues, and EK United received further funding of £185,000 earlier this year, and they will use it to modernise showers and ensure they are accessible for disabled people, as well as to build a new 7-a-side pitch. This development is really building wealth in the community, particularly with the socially just use of land and property. The only negative of this story is that this is the only example of a community asset transfer in East Kilbride. Applications in South Lanarkshire have grown in the past year, but I would love to see more transfers taking place in East Kilbride. I look forward to hearing contributions and to see how asset transfers are working in practice from members across the country. And I would like to see councils publishing lists of the buildings and land that they own, including where they are occupied or not, or even under-occupied, as well as a condition report. This could help people, and I know a few in East Kilbride this would apply to see what might be available for an asset transfer so that buildings and land can be used by groups to serve the community. Presiding Officer, the SNP in government is working to ensure more people and local communities in Scotland have a greater stake in our economy, sharing ownership and building resilience to create a fairer and more secure economic future. A focus on place-based, community-led regeneration is welcome. With the recent news of East Kilbride shopping centres owners going into administration, I want to see South Lanarkshire Council do everything it can, including assessing the opportunity to buy the centre to ensure its survival. I've been in touch with the administrators, the council and other relevant parties, and I hope we can all work together, including with local residents, to protect and enhance the town centre. Through its use of community wealth building approach to economic development, the Scottish Government has helped local businesses and communities have a greater stake in how their local economy functions. A culture of community wealth building will help to transform local places, including in East Kilbride, and deliver a wellbeing economy. I look forward to seeing this continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Stevenson. I now call Paul O'Kane to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Around 4 minutes, Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to be able to speak in this important debate and to support my party's amendment. And I want to focus my comments today on some of the experiences from my own working life, but also from asset transfer experience in my communities across West Scotland, because I think there's a real sense in the debate today that the general principles of the legislation are good and well-intentioned in devolving power to local communities and empowering local citizens to take ownership of community assets of strategic or historic importance. Indeed, many of the assets we've heard mentioned by colleagues already are often the anchors within communities, and particularly in town centres and village centres as well. And I think it was necessary legislation which equalised the process to some extent, giving more options to urban communities as well to take control of assets. And we've heard already, I think, some of the importance of that. And Labour is indeed proud of our establishment of such rights to own community land and community assets, which were established in the very first years of this Parliament. And indeed, there have been really positive examples of communities who led the way in that, using that legislation. And indeed, one known well to the Minister and myself is the community of Neilston, where I'm from, where Neilston Development Trust led the way by purchasing the old bank through community right to buy legislation, which is now a community hub within the village and has become a real asset with a community cafe, lots of different groups meeting there and using the space, and indeed the Neilston Community First Responder Service operating out of that base. So it shows what can be done when one asset leaves a place and is replaced by something that can fulfil a gap that is in some ways created. However, I think I would agree with the comments that have already been made by colleagues about the system needing to be perhaps simplified and made more accessible for people. When I worked in the voluntary sector, in the precursor to the TSIs that were mentioned by Paul McLennan, we were at the very beginning of the consultations on much of this legislation, and I remember at that time having conversations with colleagues and with community groups in Eastern Bartonshire about the need to build capacity in community groups to be able to be upskilled and be ready to take on community assets, because it's not always an easy thing to do. And I think it's particularly challenging very often in community groups and organisations where the board and the committee of the group are just trying to keep the lights on and the doors open and provide all the services that they provide, to then be asked to become a legal expert, an expert in perhaps deeds and trusts, an expert in the funding that's available for these sorts of things. So capacity, I think, has always had to be built and has always been at the heart of this. But very often, because of other decisions taken in spending, there hasn't always been the same level of support for that capacity being available. And I would say that's probably true on the council side as well, because having been a councillor for 10 years, what I've seen quite clearly is that very often the departments that are set up to deal with a lot of these transfers have been depleted. And what we don't have is the same level of staffing able to support communities who want to see that asset transferred. I want to highlight, I think, something that's important, not just about physical buildings, but I think the importance of community spaces, which can be supported and cared for through asset transfer. There are a number of excellent youth football clubs in my region who are really keen to take an asset transfer of old playing fields in their community and use them for the benefit not just of the football clubs that they run, but indeed for the wider community. And I know that they have had challenges in engaging with councils across the region and being able to do some of this. And I'll mention Port Glasgow Juniors, Bishopton Football Club, Neilson Football Club and St Cadoc's Youth Football Club, who've all come to my door asking for help and support. And again, I think it is really about having that capacity built in. So I'm conscious of time, Presiding Officer, perhaps just to conclude. I know that Mary McCallan has committed to ensuring that community groups going through the community asset transfer system have a dedicated caseworker. I think that's important and something we need to follow up. And I think we have to offer a lending hand to people who want to improve their communities, not putting hurdles in their way. So I hope that the Minister here today will listen to some of the feedback and be able to reflect in his closing on what we can do to make this process easier and more accessible. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. And I call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Jenny Minto in 4 minutes. Mr McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a great honour to speak in this debate today on asset transfers. And my constituency of Coatbridge and Christen has seen this policy utilised very effectively through a number of projects since the Act was introduced, perhaps bucking the trend that Douglas London spoke about earlier, about there not being very many in urban areas. And I'm going to take the opportunity today to reference some of them here. These transfers are at their heart seeking to include more people in local communities across Scotland and having a greater stake in our economy, sharing ownership and building resilience to create a fairer and more diverse economic future. Community asset transfers symbolise a Scotland where everyone can play their part and contribute to society at a local level. A great example of this can be found with the Glenboig Development Trust, who took full advantage of the community asset transfer process to develop the Life Centre. The centre truly acts as a cornerstone of community life in the village of Glenboig for so many people living in the area. In its capacity as a local community hub, the Life Centre promotes the health and well-being of the local community, and this is realised through schemes that encourage physical and mental well-being, combating isolation and fostering a sense of community. The centre works with roughly 20 diligent volunteers on a regular basis. These volunteers support the day-to-day running of the centre's community cafe, village post office, community transport service and other services and activities. Presiding Officer, this SNP government seeks to continue a long-running agenda of community regeneration through the Empowering Communities programme. In the case of the Glenboig Development Trust, they were able to avail of £1 million in Scottish Government funding from the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund. Further funding was also secured through the Scottish Land Fund. This underlines, I think, the Scottish Government's commitment to empowering local community projects like these. Elsewhere in my constituency, the Scottish Land Fund awarded a £68,000 grant to the Kirkshaws Neighbourhood Centre. This investment allowed the centre to find a permanent home at the site of former tenement buildings. And just like the Life Centre in Glenboig, the Kirkshaws Neighbourhood Centre supports the community through a range of services and activities, including over 65's IT training, an employment programme, community cooking classes, and most recently a community fridge that I had the pleasure of attending the opening for. The Centre's good work continues to be recognised and they continue to be awarded grants to further their community aims. Just last week I circulated a motion commending the Centre on securing an amazing £150,000 grant from the National Lottery Community Fund, and this will finance a 3-year project which will benefit over 3,000 people in Coatbridge in my constituency. Local communities have a better knowledge of how their areas can be enriched, as we've heard from others, so it's vital, especially during this cost of living crisis and economic uncertainty, that these local communities and organisations are given greater powers over their own future. The pandemic emphasised the necessity for strong community spirit and a sense of coming together. Indeed, during the summer of 2021, when restrictions were beginning to ease, the Cliftonville and Coatdyke Community Group utilised the mechanism to take over the Coatbridge Indoor Bowling Club and transformed it into a vital community asset which contains a tea room, a function room and an education centre. The group retained the bowling club, which is still based at the centre, and I'm happy to remind the Chamber that the club are the current holders of the Scottish Senior Singles title and the Senior Gents Fours title, and I wish them the best of luck in next year's British Isles Championship. And good luck also to the fantastic Lanarkshire Deaf Services, who are at an early stage in their potential process for a community asset transfer. These are all good examples, and as I said earlier, I do think it bucks the trend in terms of being a very urban area. But I would say, when community groups speak to me, they are still concerned about hurdles and delays, and often talking about jumping through hoops, and often the process taking years from first identification of a site that they would like to be transferred. A lot of these examples actually took quite a long time. And I think that that's something that the government could look at. And take Dunbeth Football Club, for instance, and I should say, presiding officer, I know you're a football fan, I should say my eldest son plays for the 2014, so I'd like to put on record my thanks for the tireless work of the head coach, Gary Bradley, and indeed all the coaches who give up so much of their own time. Well, the club took over an old pavilion for their games, a simple pavilion, and training for their games and their training and their work through the Kieran McDade Festival. However, they are still in the prolonged process of having the asset transferred over. It just feels like it should be a lot simpler. Presiding officer, I also wanted to talk about the Airdrie Harriers at Langone Sports Centre, but I don't think I'm going to have time, and I'm seeing that is not going to be the case. So in terms of coming to a conclusion then, I will say that I will speak to the Minister directly about the Airdrie Harriers and their plans for an asset transfer at Langone Centre, and I'll speak to him separately about that. And thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I'm sure the Airdrie Harriers will forgive you. I now call Jenny Minto to be followed by Ariane Burgess. Around 4 minutes, Ms Minto.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Walking into the Rockfield Centre in Oban, you cannot help but be struck by the bright primary colours, the warmth, the welcome and the creativity of the space. The Rockfield Centre is a shining example of a community driving positive change and achieving its ambitions through ownership and management of a building. Rockfield is in the centre of Oban. It was the town's response to the Education Act of 1872 being built as a school to educate around 400 children in Oban. The grand opening of Rockfield Primary School took place in 1877. Parents had been asked to present their children with clean faces and hands, and where possible, adequately clad. 145 years later, in June this year, the refurbished building's doors were officially reopened by the Minister, where I'm pleased to say everyone had clean faces and hands and were adequately clad. Oban Communities Trust was established in 2014 following a community campaign to purchase and save the building. The local community had identified a desire to establish a cultural hub which would support 4 themes determined through extensive community consultation. The former classrooms now host a programme of events, workshops and activities covering these themes, which are arts and culture, history and heritage, community wellbeing and education and enterprise. The Rockfield team work with local service providers to create activities which meet their needs. For example, Alzheimer's Scotland, Dementia Scotland, Enable Scotland, Young Carers and also health and education services. And in response to the cost of living crisis, the centre is part of the Warm Spaces initiative and in January are starting a free breakfast club for school children and free after-school club 3 days a week. There are also plans to create a traditional skills hub and funding is also being sourced to create a purpose-built sensory room. People at the heart of their community, recognising what their community needs and empowered to deliver. And in my opinion, this is the key to successfully growing community wealth as those opportunities come in all shapes and sizes. And slightly before this legislation, 10 years ago in South Kintyre, RAF Machrihanish Air Base was purchased by the community, securing its lifeline air service and providing Machrihanish Air Base Community Company with 1,000 acres of opportunity. Watchtowers, military bunkers, military accommodation blocks, even a parachute drying tower and a disused bowling alley, which is now home to the UHI Argyll's Brewster Construction and Engineering Centre, and they've also got so much land. Employment peaked pre-COVID at 252. There are 125 tenancies, and direct spend on local contractors from MAC sits at £2.42 million, and also £75,000 has been donated to local charities. MAC are also progressing environmental aims by installing a solar farm and recently broke ground, helped by 6 local schools, on the 10,000 Trees project that will support the site's diverse wildlife. I was very pleased to host the Minister for Business, Trade, Tourism and Enterprise at MAC this summer. This is a success, but it could be so much more. Geography and perception hinder its development. MAC, its assets and Kintyre have significant potential. Therefore, continued and, if I might suggest, enhanced policy support to realise this is needed. In preparing for this debate, I spoke to Argyll and Bute Council, and they provided me with an outline of the work the Council is doing to support community wealth building. Argyll and Bute is strong in some areas, such as community empowerment, community assets and wealth generation. The circular economy, including procurement, but is weaker in other areas such as local skills development and access to affordable finance. A study is being commissioned in partnership with HI and the TSI, which will help determine strengths and weaknesses in relation to a wellbeing economy in greater detail. And I welcome this work from the Council and look forward to analysing the report. Presiding Officer, to conclude, I've only highlighted 2 empowered organisations in my constituency, but there are so many more. So very quickly, South West Mull and Iona Development, South Isla Development, and of course the hundreds of volunteers supporting community wealth growing, community empowerment and community wellbeing across Argyll and Bute. We must continue to have the courage to ensure our empowered communities have the right tools and support to be a powerful force in community wealth and resilience building that Scotland deserves.
Thank you very much, Ms Minto. I now call Ariane Burgess to be followed by Stephanie Callahan in 4 minutes. Ms Burgess.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, I welcome this opportunity to champion the work that has taken place in our communities over the last 5 years to make community empowerment a reality. It's been a pleasure to hear from community groups across the Highlands and Islands about the successes of this bill and wider land reform legislation to enable community-led regeneration. From playing fields to public toilets, community halls to growing spaces, it's clear our communities are just getting started in exercising these powers to reimagine underused local assets. Community-led regeneration has huge potential to empower local communities to tackle poverty and equality and build community wealth on their own terms. In Tomintoul, a derelict secondary school is currently being redeveloped into homes, a quarter of which will include workspaces for micro-enterprises by the Tomintoul and Glenlivet Development Trust, with support from Highlands and Islands Enterprise and the Communities Housing Trust. Sadly, Presiding Officer, the story is not always one of success. Communities face significant barriers. Some of these are structural, a lack of experience and capable volunteers with the time and skills to dedicate to this work, for example, but often they're financial. That's why the Bute House Agreement commits us to increasing the Scottish Land Fund substantially, doubling it by £20 million by 2026. While we now have numerous examples, and we've heard about them this evening, of how this approach can reinvigorate communities and provide a catalyst for investment and regeneration, we still need to address Scotland's concentrated pattern of rural land ownership, with 67% of rural land holdings being owned by just 1/44,000th of the population. That's why the Scottish Greens welcomed the proposed public interest test for large land holdings and the preemption in favour of community buyout in the recent consultation to update the Land Reform Act. The concentration of private land ownership in rural Scotland can stifle entrepreneurial ambition, reduce local aspirations and hamper the ability to address identified community need. It also places considerable power over jobs, housing and access to spaces in the hands of a few. user-friendly data on implementation of legislation such as Part 5 of the Community Empowerment Act, knowing exactly what is owned by whom in Scotland, can help us to progress, and I believe the Minister spoke to that to some degree. Presiding Officer, long-term success stories such as that of the Isle of Egg have shown how conservation and sustainability can be central to community regeneration activities. From renewable energy generation to nature conservation and ecotourism, the Community Trust is pioneering the island's transition to carbon neutrality. However, we should also acknowledge that some parts of Scotland benefit more than others from policy instruments. The Government can and should compensate for that by focusing public spending on communities most in need of support so that every community can thrive. Presiding Officer, we should take this opportunity to acknowledge the vital role land plays in addressing climate change and that community ownership provides a route to addressing this challenge. We need to put our money where our mouths are on this by ensuring community councils and development trusts are financially supported and that the purpose of community planning partnerships are much better understood. With increasing public and private sector investment in peatland restoration, woodland creation and carbon sequestration, part of ensuring a just transition must be about making sure the benefits of investment in these areas is felt as widely as possible and that local communities are empowered to manage underused, unproductive and unoccupied land around them in the ways that address the climate emergency. To conclude, Presiding Officer, whether it's through warm hubs, community growing spaces or community kitchens, deepening and accelerating the transfer of assets to communities can alleviate the cost of living crisis and the fiscal pressures currently being experienced by local authorities. This is an area I'm keen to see developed as I work with the Minister on the forthcoming Community Wealth Building Bill.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call Stephanie Callaghan, who is the final speaker in the open debate, after which we move into closing speeches. Around 4 minutes, Ms Callaghan.
There is no more powerful illustration of community empowerment than a community coming together to take control of a local asset. So I warmly welcome this opportunity, Presiding Officer, to champion community asset transfers, particularly given the positive impact community asset transfers are having in communities in my own constituency of Uddingston and Bellshill. Taking control of assets involves local people attaching a part of themselves to their community, thereby driving local ambition and strengthening cohesion. Successfully achieving a CAT is a major undertaking for any community group, but the empowerment it delivers can't be understated, ensuring delivery of better, more tailored local services and tangibly building community wealth. Whilst the majority of community asset transfers have occurred in rural and island communities, I hope Mr Sweeney will be pleased to hear that I'm going to share today 2 examples in my own urban constituency. Firstly, Bodwell Futures, who successfully took over that iconic Bodwell Library building this summer, and where they're now creating a multifunctional wellbeing hub for the benefit of all local residents. When Bodwell Futures started the CAT process with South Lanarkshire Council and Leisure and Culture, they were told the process would take 2 years, but with a small, skilled and energetic team, an impressive 20-year strategic plan and, critically, great collaboration from council officials and local councillors, I hope colleagues are glad to hear that the transfer was completed in 8 short months. Whilst Bodwell is a vibrant village, it lacks community space to deliver on the residents' exciting vision. Through this community asset transfer, the former library building is set to become the beating heart of Bodwell, breathing new life into the village and ensuring a sustainable future. View Park Gardens Trust, again in my urban constituency, Presiding Officer, is a quite different but equally inspiring example of a community asset transfer. In this case, the Trust applied to take over the much-loved View Park Gardens site that features so many local wedding photos and cherished memories for local people. The pandemic lockdown was no match for the Garden Trust's creativity, but despite the huge community support throughout a very successful engagement process, the Trust's community asset transfer request was denied by North Lanarkshire Council. Undaunted, the Trust submitted an appeal to the Scottish Government, making history by winning the right to take the land into community hands on appeal. Once delivered, this community asset transfer will provide a safe, green, inclusive space for groups and individuals, with plans for a mix of mental health and wellbeing projects, alongside community-led provisions for local clubs and charities. I, for one, cannot wait to see the gardens return to their former glory. In contrast to Bothwell Futures, the timeline to achieve success has been lengthier for the Trust, and I must pay tribute to the Community Ownership Support Service. Their advice and expertise was invaluable during the highly technical appeal process. The commitment shown by View Park Garden Trust and Bothwell Futures really is inspiring, and while the successful appeal is testament to the empowerment strength that underpins the Scottish Government's legislation, it really would be good to hear the Minister confirm the current review will look for ways to make the processes easier. As we've heard from the Minister today too, positive collaboration amongst stakeholders is key, and the independent evaluation by Glasgow Caledonian University sets out further action to support local authority and community transfer bodies and maximise the potential of community asset transfer requests. Presiding Officer, we need to see many more local authorities and public bodies welcoming requests for community asset transfers, and we need to see remaining elements of resistance removed, because the ability of community groups to consult local people, identify the complex challenges they face and deliver effective support really is unparalleled. And as we emerge from the pandemic during a cost of living and climate crisis, empowered communities are exactly what Scotland needs. We know communities can pull together and work to make their dreams a reality. Presiding Officer, it's our job to help them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Callaghan. We now move to closing speeches. I call Paul Sweeney for around 5 minutes. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's been a really interesting debate and certainly very insightful. I thank all members for the really interesting points that they've made, and I think we've developed clear understanding of where the Act has done very positive things, but also where we need to do much more to reinforce its intended outcomes for our communities across Scotland, and that's in the spirit of the amendment that the Labour has put forward today. And certainly I thank the member for Uddingston and Bellshill for offering two really interesting examples. One that seems to be running really well in the old library building, as mentioned, but also some difficulties that have been faced in going through a much more convoluted process. And it's certainly something that I have seen at first hand. I should declare interest as a trustee of the Beetroot Arts Centre in Barmulloch, which has recently acquired the old building from Glasgow City Council that it operates out of, and that's been similarly having a difficult time going through the legal aspects of having to resolve that issue. And it's something that Alexander Stewart mentioned as well in dealing with these complex legal arrangements, which can often take very long time, cost a lot of money, exhaust a lot of goodwill from people who are doing this pro bono usually, and they're not necessarily got the resilience that everyone needs to do this, see it through. So I think in that respect we need to look at very carefully what we're asking communities to do here, because often people can lose the will to live trying to get this sorted out. But all power to View Park Gardens Trust for persevering, and I'd like to see, in credit to the people that ran Beetroot as well in Barmulloch, who have seen that through and successfully achieved an outcome. But let's hope we can make this slicker in future as we learn more about how to do this, and also support our local authorities to deliver these outcomes more efficiently. I think we've seen that reflected about in speakers from across the debate today. The member for East Lothian, for example, mentioned about capacity funding and support. These are critical. We can't simply divest assets and then say in the next funding round that they've lost the budget for their oncoming. You have to make staff redundant, close their building. We need to make sure that we're not just simply passing off the brutal reality of cutbacks onto third parties from local authorities, and we need to make sure that this is properly reinforced with the financial security that will ensure resilience. And of course, we've seen across the piece, references, for example, for the member for Argyll and Bute mentioned the Education Act 1872 produced some of the most amazing architectural buildings developed in our municipal authorities. In fact, there's over 100 of these 1872 school board schools developed in Glasgow, and unfortunately, between 1919, when it was handed to Glasgow Corporation, and 2010, 60 of these schools were demolished. And in fact, today in Glasgow, there's about 15 of them still derelict. So just an example of amazing architectural artefacts. You can never build these things again. Communities were desperate to get in there and take over these buildings, but they're frustrated in many cases because whilst the will's there, the desire's there, the hope and pride in a community is there. People don't want to see this stuff blighting their local communities, but they're maybe not equipped with the skill set to do quantity surveying, legal documents to convey property, and settle complex legal arrangements with council. So and these are particularly focused in poorer districts. And if you forgive me for being parochial about Glasgow, 44% of buildings currently at risk in Glasgow are in the areas of the highest deprivation in the city, whilst only 7% currently at risk are in areas with the lowest ranked deprivation. So that in itself tells a story about the areas of greatest need are actually often the places where they've the least capacity. There isn't the lawyer living in the street, there isn't the quantitative surveyor who can get together and have the time and energy, after dealing with the cost of living crisis, feeding the kids, etc., to go down to these board meetings and do all this stuff pro bono. So I think we need to look very carefully, and I hope the Minister reflects on this in his closing remarks, because it can be really, really demoralising for community groups. And I'm sure Mr Doris in some of his interventions made this point as well. Ariane Burgess made this point as well, as other members have, including my colleague Paul Kane from West Scotland, that there are really difficult problems to face when you've done all this work, you've built something up that you think is really important, got a lot of community support, go for funding, and then you're given a cursory response that says, bad luck, wasn't up to scratch, see you next time. I think that needs to stop, and we need to say, OK, you didn't meet these criteria, maybe you need to do more about community outreach, maybe you need to do more about building partnerships locally. Here's resource that the government will now provide you with in the form of some sort of mentor or caseworker to work with you to get it to a level of rigour that you're needing, because clearly there's potential there. Clearly there's a desire in the community to do something, but maybe there are professional deficiencies that need addressed. But that's something to work with, not just simply cast out. So I would argue that the government needs to do more about making that work with communities. Springburn, for example, an area I should declare interest in as the chair of the Springburn Winter Gardens Trust as well. I've been working tirelessly for 10 years to try and get this A-listed building, Scotland's largest glasshouse, fixed up. And we've kept, you make 2 steps forward, 1 step back at every occasion. It can be really a war of attrition to try and save these amazing assets for our community. And I'm sure there's goodwill across the House to see this work. But let's actually understand that the government needs to do more to work with us to get it to a place where it can be successful. Because even I, as a member of the Scottish Parliament, member of Parliament, feel frustrated about it. And so goodness knows what other community activists are feeling like when they have these constant hurdles to overcome. So that's where we all want to see this Act improve. We want to see the delivery of the intentions of the Act improve. And I hope in that spirit we can go forward and deliver a better public policy for this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Sweeney. And I call Miles Briggs for around 6 minutes. Mr.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I think today's debate has given us an opportunity to celebrate the asset transfers in all our communities. Fulton McGregor maybe wins the award for most thank yous he was able to deliver during his support, during his speech. But I think Jenny Minto maybe gave him a run for his money as well on that. But I'm not going to be outdone, because I want to also highlight some of the great projects we've seen here in my own region. And I was pleased to support, in September 2016, Belfield, which was the first community right to buy an asset transfer in Portobello. Belfield is a community centre located in what was previously Portobello Old Parish Church. It's a Georgian church of classical design located in Belfield Street in Portobello. And the church was subject to a successful community buyout in 2017 and then reopened following some vital investment which was needed in June of 2018 and has gone from strength to strength. And there seems to be something in the water in Portobello, because there's been quite a lot of community buyouts taking place since, including the community at Portobello's Town Hall, which I know locals were really determined that they wouldn't see lost. So it just shows you when communities really use this, it can deliver results. And I think we all want to see that and all want to encourage that going forward as well. Paul Sweeney made some important points in relation to distressed community assets. And I think that is important when you look at kind of the assets which are becoming more and more difficult to take forward. That is something I think we need to look at additional support around. And although he hasn't spoken in this debate, Willie Kofi, in terms of local government committee, often raises and highlights these individual issues around individual buildings and ownership, and often the lack of capacity which councils have to address empty buildings and condemned buildings. And I think that's something we need to see more work on. Often the ownership around a building can become incredibly difficult to unpick and get to the heart of as well. Yes, happy to.
I thank the member for giving way. Would he agree with me that perhaps it is all too easy for public bodies to simply put the boards up on windows and abandon public buildings, thus leaving them to be completely dilapidated and then end up destroying the value that they are for the public purse?
No, I would agree with that point, but I also think council budgets don't allow them to do much else apart from look towards health and safety concerns of these buildings, which is their duty at the end of the day. Very quickly, yes. Happy to.
Stephanie Callaghan.
Thank you for taking the intervention. There's also the point as well, though, where you can actually be looking at council saving monies on these properties as well, because they may be paying £15,000, for example, to do the upkeep etc. there as well. And actually, if they invest time and effort and they have a CAT team helping those communities to take those assets forward in a really good balanced way, that actually that's a great way forward. Thanks.
No, thank you for that. And I agree with that point. And I think that's where, and my colleague Alexander Stewart highlighted this, the process often around community asset transfer can be complicated, and we need often councils to be in that place to assist communities. And going forward, I think that is where we need to see more focus around the teams who are going to deliver this. We know planning departments are having problems in terms of staffing anyway, but this often people aren't being directly allocated to help support this work in councils, and that's something we need to see improved as well. And specifically with regards to the points which Ariane Burgess made, and I think these were important in relation to new innovative uses of buildings on high streets. And I, for one, want to see many of our high streets have opportunities to bring diverse former shops into housing use, something we need to look at. And I don't think necessarily we captured that within the national planning framework the government's bringing forward either. Now, the local government committee recently undertook an allotment inquiry. And I don't think we can honestly say that we have given community empowerment for people who want to see more green space and more growing opportunities. And that certainly was the conclusion we drew as a committee. So I think there's something very specific around how land which is within public sector ownership, which could potentially be used for community growing, isn't being released, and something we need to look at, because there is certainly, especially post-pandemic, an appetite for that to be taken forward, and I hope we can see that progressed, and that's certainly what we tried to do as a committee. One of the points members across the chamber have also looked towards is the future sustainability of projects. And I am concerned with some of the organisations I'm working with about the actual construction inflation they're facing. This has been for some time, and actually where they are with financing future projects. We're constantly returning to government and also local government to ask for that support. But I think planning and the organisations which often provide grants for that are becoming more and more difficult to access, I would say, and we need to look towards that support and how it's going to be delivered. Finally, I also wanted to touch upon a point which was put to me by one of the projects with regards to where we're going to make sure that the next 5 years will be delivering the projects which are harder to meet. And I put that to the Minister, that some of these schemes have been the low-hanging fruit which these buildings can become easily transferred. There are more difficult ones, and I think Paul Sweeney really outlined this. And I think this is going to be where the legislation is really going to be tested. And so I hope that, although we've had a very welcome, positive debate today, the government shouldn't rest on its laurels, that these potential community assets, which we all want to see utilised, saved, taken forward, will be the hard ones, and ministers should make sure that those hard miles are ready to be taken forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Briggs. I now call on the Minister to respond to the debate for around 8 minutes or so, Mr.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking all members across the Chamber for their contributions. I thought this was an excellent debate, and it is of huge assistance to the Government in hearing these views as we undertake our review of the Community Empowerment Act. And I would invite members to engage with that process, which will be running to the autumn of next year. Information is provided on the Scottish Government website, but I'm happy to engage with any member directly who has an interest. I think just turning to the point that Mr Briggs raised in summing up his contribution was about the need effectively to scale up. And I would note that Ariane Burgess said that communities are just getting started. And I think what we do, while we take the opportunity to celebrate the successes of the past 5 years, to recognise the challenges that we have to overcome, we should indeed be incredibly ambitious, because our communities are ambitious, and indeed with the community wealth building model and land and property being such a been one of the 5 pillars and so central, and it's something that we have perhaps more influence over within this Parliament than we do with regards to the other pillars, that need to scale up and place community ownership through the asset transfer and other modes on a higher status, and to be more ambitious with it is something that I very much welcome. I think the key point I want to address, Presiding Officer, initially is that one what everyone has raised, which is the complexity of the process. We all recognise that the groups that have been successful in our communities have shown tenacity and often a capacity to pick themselves up after facing sometimes quite painful rejections, whether that be on funding or not feeling that we're making progress with the relevant public body. So there's clearly work to do. Part of this is through learning. Part of it, of course, will be culture change in time as well. But we need to be ambitious if we want to realise the full potential of asset transfer and community ownership. So with regards to the actions that the Scottish Government is taking, through our National Asset Transfer Action Group, we are working with partners, both communities, local, regional and national. I think one of the key roles that group can play, and indeed others can play and we can all play, is around ensuring best practice. I think there was a point that Mr Sweeney raised with regards to support that can be provided by public bodies. Now that is important, and indeed the Scottish Government does provide support to the Community Ownership Support Service, which is delivered via DTAS. But there's also a tremendous amount of learning out there from community organisations that have successfully taken on ownership. So we want to be pairing up those who are perhaps at the start of our journey with those who already have some considerable experience. And one of the things I would want to highlight is actually a project that we embarked on last year. It was a hub and spoke project with the Community Ownership Support Service in Barmulloch in Glasgow. The project was jointly funded by the Scottish Government and COS, and it was designed to explore whether an experienced, well-connected community anchor organisation could provide a different type of support to community groups in an area of disadvantage, considering asset ownership or management. Just in terms of detail, it utilised local anchor organisation Barmulloch Community Development Company to support 13 local community groups to engage with the asset transfer process who otherwise may not have done so, helping them to develop their plans. BCDC staff offered hands-on free services which included early advice on organisational structure, board responsibilities, capacity requirements, indicative costs, revenue earnings, sustainability, legal requirements and forward planning. And the Hub and Spoke project has proved to be popular, and a proactive model has now been explored where BCDC could approach groups with ideas for future use of assets, enabling some of our most marginalised communities to take part. The learning from this is something that we're going to take on board as part of our review of the Community Empowerment Act. But I think it's a great example of where communities have been through that process can provide that peer support firsthand.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank the Minister for giving way, and I recognise the excellent work that BCDC are doing with the Government to try and build that capacity. But would I bring him to the point about, for example, the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund just simply being a kind of reject or award, and I think that needs to be improved about actually helping organisations get to a position where they can be successful in future rather than just simply being kind of thrown back at them.
Minister, I didn't give you the time back.
Yeah, this is something that is of concern to me. I just have to be very blunt. There is a capacity issue with Planning, Architecture and Regeneration Division. We would just not have the means to go and engage directly with every organisation. We would encourage local authorities who partner with us to provide that support. But I am happy to consider ways in which we can provide more feedback, because I think that's so important, because ultimately, my experience has been, both as a constituency member and since taking on this ministerial role, is that community organisations, it's not often the rejection that can be the most challenging or difficult part. It's the not knowing or not understanding what the issues were, because there is, I appreciate, a continuous drive to improve and to bring bids back. So that's something that I'm very happy to take away and to consider more fully. But I think we are starting from a very solid set of foundations. I think this is something that we can build on. I think as we move into next year and as we begin the process of consulting on legislation around community wealth building, with land and property being a key pillar for that, one of the things that I will be hoping to obtain out of the consultation is to identify what are the existing barriers to embedding and consolidating the community wealth building model, but also expanding that. So where we do have the review of the Community Empowerment Act, which can consider Part 5 specifically, there is that opportunity to look more widely. And one of the issues that has come up is where we do provide capital support, it is often this capacity building support which is required as well. Now, yes, that can be about providing information and signposting, but it also requires resource, revenue, and that's where our Empowering Communities programme comes in, via Strengthening Communities or Reinvesting in Communities Fund. And I think that speaks to the point about the need for a coherent, joined-up approach. It's not enough just to award a pot of money. There has to be that capacity building. But I think that in itself can act as a catalyst and as an inspiration for other groups to go and take on assets, because fundamentally there's no more powerful motivator or fillip to action than seeing someone just like you take on an asset and you think we can do that ourselves, our community can do that. So I think that's something that is it's fundamental to advancing this model and also to realising the ambitions of scaling it up via community wealth building. Mr Briggs did touch on community growing. I think there's some really interesting work we can do there within community wealth building around localising supply chains and looking how we can partner that up. So I think that's something to be really keen to take forward. Alexander Stewart touched on a number of issues in his contribution. Obviously very grateful for the work that the Local Government and Communities Committee did in the last session, which is informing our approach. He touched on the challenging process, but also the importance of cultural change, which is significant. He made reference to issues around ARIOs. That's something I'm alive to. We're having engagement with costs. Sometimes it can just be around issues around transparency. But fundamentally, there should be nothing stopping ARIOs engaging within this process, and that's something I'm keen to explore further. The issue of planning appeals did come up. What I would again just say with regards to planning appeals, the vast majority are decided by independent reporters. Out of perhaps less than 200 considerations last year, less than only a handful came to ministers directly, less than half that went to reporters were overturned, and we're talking less than 200 out of 27,000 planning decisions overall, the vast majority taken by planning authorities. I think one of the key issues around community empowerment in the planning system is getting people involved far earlier in the process in shaping the development plan. Local place plans have a role to play in that, but I think that can be a much more effective way of ensuring that communities' voices are heard. Early engagement at the beginning of the process, rather than finding ourselves in a situation where there's a challenge made at the end of the process when there's an application in. Colette Stevenson highlighted some of the examples from East Kilbride. I would just want to note that South Lanarkshire Council have been engaging with the Scottish Government and COS on setting up a knowledge network, which is very welcome, and also thank Colette Stevenson for her recognition of the community wealth building model. I also want to recognise Mr O'Kane's contribution. We come from the same part of the world, and we all recognise the tremendous work that has taken place in Neilston, and I couldn't possibly speak on about asset transfer and not mention Lynwood Community Development Trust, who have done a huge amount of work. One of the issues that Mr O'Kane raised was something that Mary McCallum had referred to in a previous debate around a detailed caseworker. I think one of the key things we probably want to arrive at in terms of the 95 bodies is for a single point of contact, rather than someone feeling that we're having to speak to multiple different individuals. That single point of contact who can provide the information that they require. How am I doing for time, Presiding Officer?
You're coming towards the end of it, I would say.
Okay, I had that feeling. Look, let me just bring my remarks to a conclusion by saying that this has been a really helpful and stimulating debate. I'm sorry I can't respond to everyone directly. I've been grateful for the opportunity to get out and about over the past 12 months and see some of these asset transfers in action and see the fantastic work that has taken place. This has been a really positive debate. I would just say that, unfortunately, I'm not able to support either of the amendments. The Labour amendment essentially removes the entire government amendment and replaces it with something else. As the Conservative Party will understand, the Scottish Government has deep reservations about the UK Government's approach to levelling up. However, having said that, I do want to recognise the contribution that members have made across the Chamber, and I look forward to continued engagement going forward as we work to empower our communities.
That concludes the debate on asset transfers and community empowerment 5 years on. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 7271 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to next week's business. And I call on George Adam to move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and moved.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak on the motion. The question is that motion 7271 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first is that Amendment 7247.1 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, which seeks to amend Motion 7247 in the name of Tom Arthur on asset transfers and community empowerment 5 years on, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yeah. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to vote, and there will be a brief pause to allow members to access digital voting.